Ridgemont greeted Allison Frost with gray, fine rain and the smell of pine trees. The small town 2 hours from Portland seemed extinct on this foggy April morning. The detective drove her used Ford down the main street, looking at the neat two-story houses, the small square with the monument to Civil War heroes, and the town hall painted a light beige color. But the real heart of Ridgemont was not its sleepy main street. 3 miles to the east, on a hill surrounded by barbed wire, stood the grim walls of the maximum security Ridgemont Correctional Institution. The prison employed nearly a third of the town's population and was its main source of livelihood. Allison drove at a measured pace, trying to memorize the location of the few stores, the drugstore, and the only bar with a worn sign, Joe's. She was going to be a part of this world for the next few years. After the scandalous case in Portland, which she had uncovered by exposing corruption at the top of the police force, Allison had been effectively exiled. However, she was glad for it. Too much dirt had to pass through her. New place, new life, she murmured as she parked outside the 2-story brick building of the police station. That same morning, but a couple miles away, Sarah Hogan was walking down the long hallway of the prison's administration building. Her heels tapped confidently on the concrete floor, and she held a file folder firmly in her hands. "Good morning, Mrs. Hogan." The guard nodded respectfully as she passed through the metal door. "Morning, Benny," she smiled. "How are the children?" "They're growing like crazy," the man said brightly. "The youngest one's on his way. Say hi to Maggie." Sarah slipped through the door and continued on her way. In her 43 years, Sarah Hogan looked 35. Slim figure, short brown hair, always impeccable makeup. The wife of the warden, she was in charge of food procurement and supervised the formation of rations for the prisoners. A dusty job with a good salary, which she got solely thanks to her husband. Victor Hogan had been in charge of Ridgemont Prison for 16 years and was a respected man in town. 52 years old, graying whiskers, military bearing, and a reputation as a fair but strict warden. He had made Ridgemont a model institution with minimal violence and drugs. Sarah walked into a small office where 2 other women, Brenda and Liz, who were in charge of documentation and records, were working. They said hello, and Sarah got right down to business. "Girls, I need last month's supply summaries. I also need new bids from vegetable suppliers. I think we're changing partners again. It's all ready to go." Brenda, a full-figured woman with glasses, held out a heavy folder. "And Rick from the farmhouse called. He says the new batch of potatoes are no good." "Oh, really?" Sarah frowned. "I'll have to check it out in person then. I'll do it this afternoon." At 4:30, Sarah went down to the utility block, a large room with industrial refrigerators, storerooms, and a huge kitchen where food was prepared for 600 prisoners. 12 men from among the well-behaved prisoners worked here under the supervision of guards. Mrs. Hogan, Rick, a red-faced chef with tattoos on his arms, wiped his hands on his apron. "I've set aside some samples for you. Look for yourself. It's a disgrace." He led her to one of the tables where the cut potatoes lay. Indeed, most of the tubers were covered with black spots. How was this even accepted? Sarah was indignant. "I'll contact the supplier tomorrow. We'll have to use the reserve stock." "I've already made the arrangements." Rick nodded. "Thorne's helping with inventory." "Thorne?" she asked. "Jason Thorne, the new guy. He's been with us 3 months. Smart guy, worked in accounting before he went to jail." Sarah went into the pantry, where floor-to-ceiling shelves were filled with canned goods, cereal packets, and flour. Against the far wall, a young man in a gray uniform was methodically counting jars and making notes in a notebook. "Mrs. Hogan's here to see you," Rick called out, and turned to Sarah. "I'm going into the kitchen to check on dinner." When Thorne turned, Sarah froze involuntarily. Tall, with regular features and unusually bright blue eyes, he didn't fit the image of a typical prisoner. No tattoos or scars, neatly trimmed blonde hair, and that look of scrutiny and appraisal. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Hogan." His voice sounded calm and confident. "I'm just finishing up a stock check on the canned beans. We have a minor discrepancy with the paperwork. 11 cans missing. It could be an accounting error." Sarah tried to keep her voice steady, even though she didn't know why she was suddenly nervous. "Check it again and let Rick know." "Sure." He tilted his head slightly, still looking her straight in the eye. Do you want the full report or just the discrepancies? A full report. She fixed her hair absently. What crime are you serving time for, Thorne? It was a question she didn't usually ask prisoners. None of her business. But something pushed her to find out more about this man. Financial fraud, he smiled with just his lips. Got a little creative in accounting for the assets of the company he worked for. 5 years of maximum security for $20 million I never got around to spending. And you have no regrets? Regret what? The money or getting caught? His eyes sparkled for a moment. Either way, it was my decision. I'm always responsible for my decisions, Mrs. Hogan. She could hear some implication in his words. Sarah nodded sharply. Get on with your work, Thorne. The report is needed by tomorrow morning. As she left the utility room, she felt a strange excitement. It had been a long time since she'd met such an interesting companion, sharp wit, politeness, and a kind of inner strength. And those eyes. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah began to appear in the farmhouse much more often. She found many reasons, checking the quality of food, control over the formation of rations, new instructions on nutrition, and each time she sought out a meeting with Jason Thorne. Their conversations grew longer and more frank. He told her about the books he'd read in the prison library, about his travels before his incarceration, about his views on life. She caught herself waiting for these meetings, preparing for them as if they were dates. One day, while checking the new equipment in the utility room, they were alone together. The conversation was about poetry. Thorne was quoting Rilke, and his voice sounded so heartfelt that Sarah involuntarily took a step closer. You're an amazing woman, he said suddenly. Too bright for this place. You're not like the average prisoner either, she replied, feeling her pulse quicken. We're both out of place, aren't we? His hand gently touched her wrist, and Sarah didn't pull away. That touch sent electric shocks through her. She knew she was doing something unforgivably stupid, but she couldn't stop herself. 10 years of marriage to Victor, consumed only by work in recent years, had left a void in her soul that was now being filled by this man. The first kiss had happened there, in the back room among the sacks of flour and boxes of canned goods. It had been crazy, a risk that could have cost her reputation and Jason the weight of the regime. But neither of them wanted to stop. On the same days that Sarah was plunging into the maelstrom of forbidden relationships, Detective Allison Frost was settling in at the Ridgemont police station. The staff was small, the chief of police, 2 detectives, including her, and 4 patrol officers. We're a quiet town, Chief Gordon McKenzie, a heavy-set pre-retirement man, told her. Mostly petty theft, domestic disputes, the occasional teenager. There's hardly any serious crime. What about prison? Allison asked. 600 inmates, many with serious sentences. Doesn't that pose a problem? Warden Hogan has it under control, the chief said respectfully. In 16 years, not a single major riot or mass escape. Sometimes there are fights between inmates, but that's an internal matter. The city doesn't bother the prison. But Allison couldn't escape the feeling that beneath Ridgemont's calm surface lurked currents the locals preferred not to talk about. Sarah and Jason's secret meetings continued. They learned to exploit surveillance camera blind spots, to choose times when the risk of being discovered was minimal. For Sarah, it became a drug, the thrill, the passion she hadn't felt with her husband in a long time. At the beginning of the summer, she noticed that she began to tire quickly. Headaches appeared and periodic fever. Writing it all off as stress, she decided to have a routine checkup at the city clinic, not wanting to go to the prison doctor. There was too great a risk that Victor would find out about her ailment and become concerned. Dr. Anna Wong, a petite woman with a discerning eye, examined her carefully and ordered the standard tests. It's nothing, she reassured Sarah. It's probably just fatigue, but let's rule out other causes. 3 days later, Sarah was back in Dr. Wong's office. Something in the expression on the doctor's face made her tense. Mrs. Hogan, the doctor's voice sounded too formal. I have some unpleasant news. Your tests came back positive for HIV. The world around Sarah shook. She stared at the doctor, not understanding, not believing what she heard. It's impossible, she whispered. There must be a mistake. We rechecked the results. Anna Wong spoke softly but firmly. Unfortunately, there is no mistake. You need to start treatment as soon as possible. But how? Sarah couldn't formulate the question. HIV is transmitted through blood or unprotected sex. The doctor looked at her carefully. Perhaps you should talk to your husband. No! Sarah almost screamed. I mean, I'll definitely talk to him, but it's definitely not from him. Dr. Wong silently handed her information brochures and a prescription for the first course of medication. It's not a fatal disease now, she said. With the right treatment, you can lead a normal life for many years. But you need to tell everyone you've been close to recently about the risk. Driving back home, Sarah drove on autopilot. The only thought bouncing around in her head was Jason, the only man, other than her husband, she'd had a relationship with in recent years. But Victor was healthy. She knew that for a fact. So Jason had, on purpose, knew and kept quiet, or didn't know, or didn't. She parked the car outside her house, a large, 2-story cottage with a well-kept garden, and sat for a long time, unable to get out. Anger and despair grew inside. Her whole life, calm and measured, was crumbling before her eyes. In the evening, when Victor returned from work, she met him with a feigned smile and a cooked dinner. She wasn't ready to tell him the truth. She needed to deal with Jason first. You look tired, her husband said, kissing her cheek. Is everything all right? Just a little migraine, she lied. Tomorrow everything would be fine. But she knew nothing would ever be fine. Never. Sarah stayed up all night. She lay with her back turned to Victor, who was sleeping peacefully, and stared wide-eyed into the darkness. Thoughts swirled in her head like vultures over a dying man in the desert. HIV. The 3 letters that had redefined her entire life. 3 letters that had turned passion into a nightmare. By morning, she knew for sure. Jason had infected her on purpose, insidiously planned his revenge on society through the warden's wife. What is that but subtle manipulation? All his talk of literature, his philosophical musings are nothing more than a play to draw her into his web. Sarah? Her husband's voice brought her out of her daze. You haven't slept? Bad dreams, she lied, getting out of bed. The coffee would be ready in 15 minutes. In the bathroom, she took a long look at her reflection. There was no outward change, but inside everything had turned upside down. She was now the carrier of a deadly virus, a time bomb. All because of him, Jason Thorne, and his deceptively sincere blue eyes. Over breakfast, Victor talked about the problems at the prison. Conflict between groups of inmates, suspected drug shipments through one of the guards. Sarah nodded without listening. She needed to decide what to do about Jason. Tell her husband? Go on record? But then their affair would be revealed and her reputation would be destroyed. She'd lose everything. Her husband, her social standing, her respect. You seem distracted today, Victor said, finishing his coffee. Are you sure everything's all right? Yes, I'm just thinking about a new supplier. Sarah smiled strainedly. Don't worry. By the way, how's the new guy in the utility room? Thorne, I think. Jason Thorne? Victor frowned. It's odd that you're asking about him. I was just having some doubts about his transfer to the holding cell. Too fast for a prisoner with his time. But his record's good. No disciplinary action. Let him work if he can handle it. He, doesn't raise any suspicions. Suspicion? Victor raised his eyebrows in surprise. What do you mean? Well, I don't know. He's strange, not like the other prisoners. Too educated, too... She paused, realizing she was getting too emotional. Sarah, what's going on? You've never been interested in prisoners before. Victor looked at her intently. If you have any specific concerns, speak up. No, nothing. She rose quickly from the table. Just a general impression. Forget it. Back at the prison, Sarah avoided the utility room all day. She wasn't ready to face Jason. Every time she pictured his face, she felt so furious that she was afraid she'd lose her temper and tell him in front of witnesses. On her lunch break, she walked into the office of Brenda, her purchasing assistant. Brenda, I need information on Jason Thorne, she said as she closed the door tightly. Everything we have in the system. About the prisoner? Brenda blinked perplexedly. But you know we don't have access to personnel files. It's only through the husband or by special request. I know, Sarah interrupted, but I need some basic information. When he was admitted, where he was transferred from, previous placements. It's supply related. I think he's hiding something. It was an outright lie. But Brenda, always willing to help her boss, nodded. I'll see what I can do, but it will take time. We need to get around some of the limitations of the system. Thank you, Sarah squeezed her hand gratefully, and not a word to anyone. That evening, at home, she opened a search engine page on her laptop and typed in Jason's name. To her surprise, there were many results. The financial scandal of 5 years ago had been widely covered in the press. Jason Thorne, 34 years old, so he's 39 now, the CFO of a software company, had been convicted of embezzling $20 million through a complex scheme of sham contracts. Some articles mentioned his girlfriend or wife, Melissa Clark, who was also suspected of complicity, but was acquitted for lack of evidence. Sarah did not find photos of the woman, but came across an old interview with Jason, where he talked about his passion for extreme sports. I'm always looking for thrills, he said with a smile. Life without risk is no life. Sarah closed her laptop when she heard the front door slam. Victor had returned, but the information she'd gotten only made her more certain. Jason was a manipulator, used to playing with fire and not thinking about the consequences for others. At night, she had a strange dream. She was standing in the middle of the prison yard, and crows were circling around her. One of them, the largest with bright blue eyes, was perched on Jason's shoulder, staring right at her. Sarah woke up in a cold sweat. The next morning, she received a text from Brenda. Found something interesting. Come by the office. Brenda greeted her with a nervous smile. I checked Thorne's movements between prisons. He was indeed at Blue Mountain before he was transferred to us. But there's an oddity. His medical records note that he was diagnosed with HIV a month before his transfer. Sarah felt the ground slipping from under her feet. So he knew. He knew for sure. Who else had seen this information? Her voice trembled. Only the medical staff. It's confidential. But the prisoner should have been informed. And of course, he's getting the therapy he needs. Thank you, Brenda. Sarah struggled to keep her outward composure. It's very important. Please don't tell anyone you showed me that data. As she walked out of the office, she leaned against the wall, trying to deal with a bout of nausea. She knew for sure now. Jason had infected her deliberately. He was aware of his status, receiving treatment, and yet he'd gotten intimate with her without a word about the risks. The rage that had been simmering inside her since the doctor's visit had reached a boiling point. He hadn't just ruined her health and jeopardized her marriage, he'd intentionally caused her irreparable harm, which meant he deserved to be punished. The plan had matured instantly, as if it had always been somewhere in the back of her mind, waiting for the right moment. Sarah was in charge of the rations, so she could control what each prisoner would receive. Poison? Too obvious and easy to trace. But what if she used something that wouldn't raise suspicion until a certain point? She thought of a local farm that supplied mushrooms for the prison kitchen. Among the usual mushrooms, sometimes there were poisonous ones, and they were necessarily culled. But what if a few of those mushrooms happened to be in Jason's personal rations? In her office, Sarah immersed herself in researching information about the region's poisonous mushrooms. The pale grebe is too dangerous and conspicuous. But fly mushrooms, especially the white fly mushroom, which looks a lot like mushrooms, are ideal. Not deadly poisonous for a healthy person, but causing severe poisoning. And for someone with a weakened immune system. The next day, Sarah went into the woods on the pretense of going for a walk. When she returned home with mushrooms for a special dish, she carefully separated one specimen, a small white mushroom, almost indistinguishable from an ordinary mushroom. Packing it in a plastic container, she stashed her find in her bag. At the prison, Sarah went down to the utility room for the first time in days. Jason was there, sorting food for lunch. When he saw her, he smiled, the same genuine smile that had made her heart beat faster before. Mrs. Hogan, he nodded. I haven't seen you in a while. A lot of work, she said, trying to keep her voice even. How's everything going in the farmhouse? Everything's on schedule. The new delivery schedule is working great. She stared at him and couldn't believe that this man who seemed so open had deliberately caused her so much pain. Not a shadow of remorse or concern on his face, just the calm confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Glad to hear it. Sarah nodded and turned away quickly, afraid he would read something in her eyes. Keep up the good work. All day she waited for the right moment. It presented itself toward evening, when preparations for dinner began in the utility block. The prisoners were packing their rations, and Sarah passed by one of the tables and discreetly placed a container of mushrooms among the food for Jason's cell. Special attention to prisoner Thorne's rations, she told the cook. He's had some complaints about the quality of his food. Make sure his rations are properly formed. At home, Sarah barely touched her dinner, which made Victor uneasy. You've been acting strange lately, he said. Maybe you should see a doctor. I'm fine, she replied sharply. I'm just tired. Sarah, Victor put down his fork. We've been together for 20 years. I can see that something is bothering you. Tell me. For a moment she was ready to open up, to tell everything. About the affair, about her illness, about her plan of revenge. But then she imagined the horror and disappointment on her husband's face, his disgust, the collapse of their family. No, she couldn't. Really, just tired. She forced out a smile. Let's watch a movie tonight, shall we? It had been a long time since we'd spent time together. At 11:30 p.m., Allison Frost's phone rang with a shrill ring. The detective struggled to get her eyes open and looked at the display, the Ridgemont police chief. Frost, she answered hoarsely. Allison, urgent call. Chief Mackenzie's voice sounded tense. Murder at the jail. Inmate found dead in his cell. Looks like poisoning, and it's not an accident. Victor Hogan asked for you personally. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Allison was already off the bed. Who's the victim? Jason Thorne, 39 years old. Served time for financial fraud. Model prisoner, according to Hogan. No problems with other inmates or guards. Allison dressed quickly, grabbed her bag and crime scene kit, and ran out of the house. The night was quiet and moonless. The town was asleep, unaware of the tragedy playing out outside the prison walls. Ridgemont Prison stood on a hill like a medieval castle, its outline black against the starry sky. She was met at the gate by Victor Hogan himself, a tall man with a military bearing and a tense face. Detective Frost, thank you for coming so quickly. He held out his hand. We've isolated the scene and called in the county medical examiner. But I wanted you to take a look around before pandemonium broke out here. What happened? Allison asked, following him through the checkpoint. Prisoner Jason Thorne was found dead about an hour ago. Night Patrol found him in his cell. Appears to be severe poisoning. Vomit, blood, convulsions. Hogan grimaced. I've seen a lot of deaths, Detective, but this one's particularly nasty. Any guesses as to the cause? Just guesses so far. Could be something in the food. We've seized the remains of his dinner to analyze. But it's odd that he's the only one who's been poisoned. All the inmates in his cell block get the same food. They were walking down the long corridor of B block, where prisoners with medium sentences and good behavior were kept. Ahead of them was an open cell door with 2 guards standing near it. Get ready, it's not going to be pretty, Hogan warned, signaling the guards to move away. Allison entered the cell and immediately smelled the distinctive odor of vomit and blood. On the floor, near a small metal toilet, lay the body of a young man in a prison robe. His face was contorted with a grimace of pain. Dark liquid oozed from his mouth and nose, and his hands were frozen in a convulsive clench. Judging by the position of his body and the marks, he was trying to vomit, Allison commented as she put on her gloves, realized he was poisoned. She looked around the small space of the cell, a bunk, a table, a shelf with a few books. On the table was a tray of dinner leftovers, a plastic bowl of uneaten stew, a piece of bread, an apple. When did he get dinner? 18:30 as usual, Hogan answered. According to the guard, he began to complain of severe stomach pain about an hour afterward, but he didn't go to the doctor. Probably thought it was a common disorder. Allison scrutinized the contents of the bowl. Among the pieces of meat and vegetables, remnants of mushrooms were visible. What kind of mushrooms were they? Just mushrooms, Hogan shrugged. We buy them from a local farmer and have been using them for years. Who does the grocery shopping and rationing? A strange expression flashed across Hogan's face. It's done by the administrative staff, including, my wife Sarah. She's in charge of quality control and menu planning. I'll need to talk to her. Allison made a note in her notebook. and with the kitchen staff who prepared and served dinner. Of course, Hogan nodded. They'll be available in the morning. I've instructed them not to let anyone go home until you arrive. Allison took a few photographs of the body and the scene, then left the cell, where the medical examiner, a tired, middle-aged man with a case of instruments, was waiting. Dr. Reeves, he introduced himself. Preliminary examination, or do you want to go straight to the scene? Exam first, Allison nodded. I'm interested in the approximate time of death and signs indicating the type of poison. Dr. Reeves knelt down next to the body and began his examination, commenting aloud. Time of death based on body temperature and rigor mortis is approximately 23 hours, give or take 30 minutes. Symptoms indicate a potent neurotoxin, seizures, vomiting, probably hallucinations before death. Judging by external signs, it looks like amatoxin poisoning. Amatoxins? Allison interjected. Yes, they're toxins found in certain types of mushrooms, like pale grebes and certain types of fly agaric. Very dangerous, especially for immunocompromised people. But we need a toxicology report to make an accurate conclusion. Allison nodded, making notes. The mention of a weakened immune system caught her attention. Did the victim have any health problems? Victor Hogan, standing at the door, answered, HIV positive. He was diagnosed before he was transferred to our prison. He was receiving the necessary therapy. Allison looked at the warden carefully. Who knew about his status? Only the medical staff and myself as the warden of the facility. It's confidential information. I see. Allison made another note. I'll need to speak to the prison doctor. Dr. Anna Wong. Hogan nodded. She'll be here in the morning. I've already contacted her. After the crime scene examination was completed, the body was taken to the morgue for autopsy, and Allison went to the administration building, where Hogan gave her a temporary office to work in. I've gathered all the paperwork on Thorne, he said, placing a folder on the desk. His personnel file, medical records, character references from the wardens. If you need anything else, let me know. Thanks. Allison opened the folder. I'll also need the surveillance tapes from today, especially from the utility room and the hallway where Thorne's cell is located. Sure, I'll make arrangements. Hogan headed for the door, but stopped. Detective, I want you to know I appreciate your help. This is the first case like this I've handled since I've been in charge of the prison. It's important to me that the investigation be conducted thoroughly and objectively. As he left, Allison immersed herself in the paperwork. Jason Thorne's file showed that he was a model prisoner. No disciplinary actions, positive references from the wardens, participation in educational programs. His medical records showed that he was HIV positive, diagnosed a month before his transfer to Ridgemont. He was receiving regular antiretroviral therapy, and his condition was assessed as stable. Allison couldn't shake the feeling that something important lurked behind that impeccable facade. Why Thorne? Why poisoning and not a simpler method of murder? And why now? In the morning, there was a knock on the office door. A petite Asian woman in a white coat, Dr. Anna Wong, stood on the doorstep. Detective Frost? I came as soon as I could. You wanted to talk to me about Jason Thorne? Yes, Dr. Wong, have a seat. Allison pointed to a chair. Tell me everything you know about Thorne's medical condition. I'm particularly interested in his HIV status. Dr. Wong fidgeted nervously with the hem of her robe. Jason came to us already diagnosed with HIV. According to the paperwork, the infection occurred about 6 months before he was transferred to our prison. He was on regular medication and his condition was stable, but... She stopped talking, clearly hesitating. But? Allison nudged her. About a month ago, I noticed some changes in his tests. Nothing critical, but something was bothering me. I was planning a more detailed examination next week. Did you talk to him about it? Yes, briefly. He didn't seem concerned. He said he felt fine. Who else knew about his HIV status? Dr. Wong straightened up. Officially, just me and Chief Hogan. It's confidential information that can't be disclosed without the patient's consent. And unofficially? Allison looked at the doctor carefully. Yeah. Dr. Wong looked away. I can't say for sure, but... Recently, a woman came to us with a positive HIV test. She was in a panic, looking for the source of the infection. I couldn't tell her about Thorne directly because of doctor-patient confidentiality, but, maybe she found out some other way. Allison stepped forward. "This woman is Sarah Hogan?" Dr. Wong's eyes widened in surprise. "How do you— I can neither confirm nor deny that. Doctor-patient confidentiality." But her reaction was already an answer. The puzzle was beginning to come together. The warden's wife, in charge of prisoner nutrition, and the HIV-positive prisoner who died of poisoning. The connection seemed obvious, but proof was needed. "Dr. Wong, I understand your professional limitations," Allison said softly. "But this is a murder case. If you know something, now would be a good time to tell me." The doctor took a deep breath. "All I can tell you is that Sarah Hogan came to me with a positive HIV test about 2 weeks ago. She was desperate and asking about possible sources of infection. I followed protocol and could not disclose information about other patients. But—" She stopped talking again. "But she could have guessed on her own," Allison finished for her. "Thank you, Dr. Wong. That's very important information." After the doctor left, Allison sat for a long time, pondering her findings. The picture was becoming clearer, but hard evidence was needed. Sarah Hogan, the person in charge of feeding the prisoners, had motive and opportunity. But did she have a reason to hate Jason Thorne enough to go on a killing spree? There could only be one answer. She had to be in a very close relationship with him to contract HIV. And when she found out she was diagnosed, she decided to get revenge. It was a cloudy morning in Ridgemont. Heavy clouds hung over the prison walls, promising a downpour. Allison Frost, having spent a nearly sleepless night studying documents, was on her way to the prison's supply room, the place where the prisoners' rations were prepared and distributed. She was greeted by Chef Rick, a large man with tattoos on his forearms and a wary look in his eyes. "So you're investigating Thorne's death?" It wasn't a question, but a statement. "It's a horrible story. I never thought it would happen in our kitchen." "Tell me about the food preparation and distribution process." Allison pulled out a notebook. "Who has access to the food and the finished dishes?" Rick led her around the huge kitchen, showing her where food was stored, how meals were prepared, and how rations were formed. "Everything is fairly strictly regulated. The food comes from trusted suppliers and is quality controlled. We do the cooking, me and 5 other prisoners working in the kitchen. Then the food is distributed on trays and delivered to the cells." "Who decides what is on the menu?" "Usually I make the choices a week in advance, and the administration has the final say. Mrs. Hogan does most of that." "Does she come here often? Does she personally check the food, the quality of the dishes?" Rick hesitated a little. "Not so much in the past. She mostly worked on paperwork, but in the last few months she's been coming in more often, especially since Thorne started working in the utility room." "What was their relationship like?" Allison asked casually. "Business, as far as I could see." Rick looked away. "Mrs. Hogan was always polite to all the inmates, but sometimes they talked. You know, not exactly warden to inmate, more like buddies, about books and music and stuff. None of my business, of course, but it seemed odd." Allison nodded, making notes. "The day Thorne died, who formed his rations?" "The usual, the inmates on duty, supervised by a guard. But Mrs. Hogan was particularly interested in his rations that day. Said he'd had some complaints about the quality of his food. Could she have added something to his portion?" Rick frowned. "Theoretically, yes. There's a lot of blind spots. Cameras aren't everywhere. But why would she do that?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Allison said thoughtfully. After a tour of the kitchen, she went to the archive where the surveillance tapes were kept. After reviewing the tapes from the utility room for the day of Thorne's death, she noticed a few oddities. Sarah Hogan did spend an unusual amount of time there, especially around the table where the rations were being formed. At one point, she was alone near the trays for a few seconds and appeared to put something on one of them. The quality of the footage didn't allow her to see the details, but it definitely looked suspicious. Allison made a copy of it and sent it to a video analysis specialist at the state police lab. Perhaps the specialized equipment could be used to see exactly what Sarah was doing with the tray. That same day, the detective requested access to Jason Thorne's personal effects. A small cardboard box contained everything that remained of the man who had spent several years behind bars: a few books, a notebook, photographs, letters, Going through these humble belongings, Allison came across a tattered notebook with a leather cover. Inside, neatly scribbled thoughts, quotes from books, and between the pages, a quadruple folded sheet of paper. Unfolding it, Allison saw a note written in a woman's handwriting. Jay, meet me tomorrow at the usual place. Can't wait. S. The handwriting looked familiar to her. Checking Sarah Hogan's signature on the documents from the administration building, Allison was sure it was her. Now she had documentation of the connection between the warden's wife and the prisoner. Flipping through the notebook further, she found several more such notes, as well as Jason's personal notes, in which he alluded to his relationship with S and described his feelings. There were new notes in the last few entries, concern, fears that she'll find out the truth and it'll all be over. What's the truth? Allison wondered. She found the answer in the last pages of the notebook where Jason had written down the results of his medical exam and his thoughts on his HIV status. How do I tell her? And should I? She's married, she has a reputation. If I tell her, it's the end of everything. If I don't tell her, I put her at risk. Even though the doctor says that with treatment, the risk of transmission is minimal. These notes confirmed Sarah's motive for murder. If she found out about Jason's HIV status after they had an intimate relationship, and especially if she herself was infected, it could have driven her to revenge. The next step was to interview Sarah Hogan. Allison found her in the administration building, in a small office cluttered with folders and invoices. Mrs. Hogan, Allison introduced herself and showed her badge. I'm investigating the death of inmate Jason Thorne. Can I ask you a few questions? Sarah looked pale and haggard, but she held her dignity. Of course, detective. What can I do for you? You're in charge of inmate nutrition. Tell me how the rations are formed and who has access to them. Sarah described the process in detail, repeating almost word for word what Rick had already told her. Allison then moved on to more personal questions. How long had you known Jason Thorne? A slight strain flashed across Sarah's face. Since he was transferred to the utility room about 3 months. And what was your relationship like? Working. Sarah looked away. He was responsible and efficient. He helped with inventory, food accounting. He had a finance background, which was helpful. Just work? Allison pressed softly, pulling the notes she'd found out of the folder. Then how do you explain this? Sarah looked at the notes and turned even paler. It's not what you think it is. What is it, Mrs. Hogan? Notes in your handwriting, found among Thorne's personal effects. Meetings in the usual place. What am I supposed to think? Sarah was silent, frantically thinking of how to get out of the situation. Look, Allison continued, I'm not investigating your personal relationships. I'm interested in the death of a man, and if there was more than a working relationship between you two, it could be relevant to the case. We had a brief affair, Sarah finally admitted, lowering her eyes. It was a mistake. I'm not proud of it. When did it end? About 2 weeks ago. Why? Sarah looked up, full of pain and anger. Because I found out he was sick, HIV positive, and he didn't tell me about it. And you took a test? Yes, positive. There was such desperation in her voice that Allison felt compassion for her for a moment. But the professional detachment quickly returned. Mrs. Hogan, where were you on the evening of Jason Thorne's death? At home with my husband. Can he confirm that? Yes, of course. We had dinner and a movie together. And during the day, did you visit the utility room? Yes, as usual. Did you take a personal interest in Thorne's diet? Sarah tensed up. Maybe. I don't remember. I have a lot of responsibilities. The security cameras caught you putting something on his food tray. What was it? Don't remember that. Maybe some kind of note or document, or just adjusting something on the tray. It didn't sound convincing, and both women knew it. Allison decided to come at it from a different angle. Do you have mushrooms in your house? What? Sarah looked genuinely surprised. What kind of mushrooms? Any kind. Do you pick mushrooms? Buy them? Grow them? Sometimes I buy them at the store. What does that have to do with it? Jason Thorne died of amatoxin poisoning, a poison found in certain types of mushrooms, like the white fly mushroom, which looks a lot like a mushroom. Sarah's face froze for a moment. Then she tried to pull herself together. I'm not a mushroom expert, detective. I don't know what you're getting at. I think you understand perfectly well. Allison closed the folder. "That'll be all for now, Mrs. Hogan, but I'll have more questions." Allison walked out of the office and went straight to Victor Hogan. The warden looked drained and tired. "Detective Frost, what's the latest?" "Mr. Hogan, I need to ask you some personal questions. It's confidential." "Ask away." He gestured for her to sit down. "Were you aware of the, close relationship between your wife and the prisoner Thorne?" Hogan sank slowly into his chair, his face darkening. "What do you mean?" "They were having an affair, Mr. Hogan, and there's proof of it." The warden was silent for a long time, digesting the information. "No, I didn't know," he said at last. Or rather, he didn't want to know. Sarah had been different lately. Different. Distant. I put it down to stress, work. "One more question. Do you know about her medical condition?" "Medical?" He frowned. "No, she didn't say anything. Is she sick?" Allison realized that he really wasn't aware of his wife's HIV status. "That's confidential information, Mr. Hogan. I was just checking. Thank you for your cooperation." Meanwhile, the toxicology results came back. The food residue from Thorne's tray contained amatoxins, poisons found in the white fly agaric. Allison had a piece of the puzzle, but was missing the key piece: direct evidence of Sarah's involvement in the poisoning. Police Chief Mackenzie was skeptical. "Allison, you have a motive. You have a theoretical possibility. But where's the proof? An affair note and a positive HIV test don't prove she put poison in his food." "I need a search warrant for the Hogan house," Allison insisted. "If she did use the mushrooms to poison him, there could be trace evidence. That's a serious accusation against the wife of a respectable man." The chief shook his head. "You'd have to have better grounds than that." "And if I find them? CCTV footage, for example? Then we'll talk." Allison went back to studying the surveillance tapes. One of them, located in the hallway next to the utility room, captured part of the surrounding area, a small grove where the employees sometimes took a smoke break. Looking through the records for the last week before Thorne's death, Allison noticed Sarah walking toward that grove with a small basket. An hour later, she returned with the same basket, but already filled with something. Allison called the local forester. "Are there mushrooms growing in the grove near the prison?" "Sure," he replied. "They're in season. You can find mushrooms and white mushrooms and, well, all sorts of things. Last year, a couple of tourists poisoned themselves by mistaking edible mushrooms for poisonous ones." It was another piece of the puzzle. Allison asked the lab to analyze the soil from that grove, and indeed, there were spores of various mushrooms, including white fly agaric. By this time, the answer came from the video analysis specialist. An improved version of the footage from the utility room showed that Sarah had indeed put something that looked like a small mushroom on Thorne's tray, seemingly indistinguishable from the mushrooms that were already in the dish. With this new evidence, Allison went to the chief again, and this time got permission to search the Hogan house. In the house, in the small pantry where Sarah kept her kitchen utensils, a mushroom basket was found with traces of soil typical of that very grove. And her computer showed traces of search terms: poisonous mushrooms in the region, white fly as white fly, symptoms of amatoxin poisoning, HIV immunocompromised. The chain of evidence closed. That same evening, Allison Frost and 2 deputies arrived at the Hogan home to arrest Sarah. Victor Hogan opened the door, looking 10 years older. "She's upstairs," he said quietly. "She's packing." "Did you know?" Allison asked. "Not about what she did to Thorne." Hogan shook his head. "But I was beginning to guess about their connection. She'd changed in the last few months. She'd become nervous, distant, and then I found her medical records." He stopped talking. "I never thought she was capable of murder." Sarah met them calmly, almost relieved. When Allison read her rights and cuffed her, she only glanced briefly at her husband. "I'm sorry, Victor, I didn't mean for it to end this way." At the police station during formal questioning, Sarah Hogan finally broke down and confessed everything. "I fell in love like a girl," she said, staring blankly at the wall. "He was so different from the other inmates. Educated, intelligent, attentive. I felt like I'd found my soulmate." "When did your relationship begin?" "About a month after he was transferred to the utility room. We started talking about books, music, then, we met in the back rooms, in the blind spots of the cells. I knew I was risking everything, my reputation, my marriage, my job, but I couldn't stop. What happened next? I started to feel sick, fatigue, fever. At first I put it down to stress, then I decided to see a doctor, but not our prison doctor because I was afraid Victor would find out. I went to the city clinic to Dr. Wong. She ordered the standard tests, including an HIV test. When it came back positive, I couldn't believe it. So you thought you got it from Jason Thorne? Who else? There was bitterness in her voice. I've never been with any other man except my husband. And Victor, he would never, he's too principled to cheat. How did you find out about Thorne's HIV status? Through our employee, Brenda. She had access to some medical records. I asked her to see if there was anything unusual in Thorne's medical records. And she did. It was diagnosed a month before he was transferred to us. He knew. He knew the whole time and he didn't say a word. So you wanted revenge? Yes, she said simply. I was furious. He hadn't just changed my life. He'd ruined it. I'd read about the mushrooms of our region, how easy it is to confuse the edible with the poisonous. The plan came naturally. Tell me exactly how you did it. I found a white fly agaric in the woods near the prison. It's not much different from a regular mushroom unless you know what to look for. I brought it to the prison in a small container and added it to Jason's rations when no one saw. I knew his weakened immune system would make the poisoning especially severe, but I didn't think he'd die so quickly and so painful. There was genuine remorse in her voice, but Allison knew the law was the law. Sarah Hogan had committed a premeditated murder, carefully planned and executed in cold blood. Sarah Hogan's trial took place 3 months later. She was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 15 years in prison. The story of adultery, HIV infection, and revenge murder became a major topic of conversation in the small town. Victor Hogan resigned as warden and left Ridgemont. He was said to have visited Sarah in prison, but their marriage was irretrievably broken. In her last conversation with Sarah before leaving Ridgemont, Allison asked, "Do you regret what you did?" Sarah was silent for a long time before answering, "I regret a lot of things. I regret giving in to weakness and starting that relationship. I regret not stopping when I could have made things right. I regret choosing revenge over common sense. But most of all, I regret the pain I caused Victor. He didn't deserve it. And Jason? Did he deserve what you did to him?" "I thought he did," Sarah answered quietly. "I was sure that he'd hurt me on purpose. But now, I don't know. Maybe he was afraid to tell me. Maybe he thought the risk was minimal. Maybe..." She stopped talking. It doesn't matter now, does it? Leaving the prison after that conversation, Allison pondered the fine line between love and hate, the masks people wore in society, and how easily those masks shattered under the pressure of fear and despair. The case was closed, the truth was established, and the guilty party was punished according to the law. But the bitter flavor of the story haunted Detective Frost for a long time to come. In a world where people so easily hurt each other, even from the sincerest of motives, finding justice is only half the battle. It's much harder to find an understanding of what drives people in the moments of their most terrible decisions. And Ridgemont continued to live his measured life, trying to forget the tragedy that happened behind prison walls. But such stories are not easily forgotten. They leave scars on people, on relationships, on the very fabric of society. And the only thing one can do is to learn from them so as not to repeat the same mistakes in the future. But experience shows that people rarely learn from other people's mistakes, preferring to make their own bumps on the same rake.